Paris in the autumn of 1942 was a city of shadows and whispers, where the chestnut trees along the boulevards still turned gold and russet as they always had. But a laughter that once echoed to the cafés had been replaced by the harsh consonants of German commands and the nervous silence of occupied people. The Eiffel Tower still stood, of course, its iron lattice stark against gray skies, but now it flew the swastika flag, and the young men in Wehrmacht uniforms who posed for photographs beneath it had no idea that their supply lines, their carefully planned logistics networks that kept them fed and armed and confident, were about to be systematically destroyed by a 26-year-old woman from Virginia who had come to Paris pretending to plan a wedding. Her name was Catherine Hayes, and before the war, she had been exactly the kind of person you would never suspect of espionage. She was born in Richmond in 1916 to a family that traced its lineage back to the Revolutionary War, the kind of old Virginia stock that valued manners over money and reputation over everything. Her father, Edward Hayes, was a history professor at the University of Virginia who specialized in European diplomatic history, and he raised his daughter on stories of intrigue and statecraft, teaching her that wars were won not just on battlefields, but in drawing rooms and embassy halls where the right word at the right time could change the course of nations. Her mother, Margaret, had died of influenza in 1919, leaving behind a 3-year-old daughter and a husband who channeled his grief into his work and his child's education. Catherine grew up in a house filled with books in 6 languages, learned to read French before she could properly read English, and by the time she was 15, could discuss Talleyrand's diplomatic strategies with the same ease that other girls discuss movie stars. She attended Radcliffe College, one of the few institutions that would accept women into serious academic programs in the 1930s, and she studied international relations at a time when most people assumed that meant she was looking for a suitable husband in the diplomatic corps. Catherine had different plans. She wanted to work for the State Department, wanted to be part of the conversations that shaped American foreign policy, wanted to prove that a woman could navigate the complex world of international politics as well as any man. She graduated summa cum laude in 1937, spoke fluent French, German, and passable Italian, and applied for positions in the Foreign Service only to be told, again and again, that women were hired as secretaries, not as diplomats. The rejection letters were always polite, always praising her qualifications, always explaining that it simply wasn't appropriate for a woman to represent American interests abroad. After the 15th rejection, Catherine stopped applying and took a position teaching French at a girls' preparatory school in Washington, D.C., trying to convince herself that shaping young minds was just as important as shaping foreign policy. When war broke out in Europe in September 1939, Catherine followed the news with the intensity of someone who understood that the world she had studied was falling apart in real time. She watched France fall in the spring of 1940, watched the newsreels of German tanks rolling to the Arc de Triomphe, and felt a fury so pure and cold that it frightened her. This was a country whose language she spoke like a native, whose literature and culture she loved, now occupied by a regime that represented everything her father had taught her to oppose. She wrote letters to every government agency she could think of, offered her services, her language skills, her willingness to do anything that might help. Most never responded. But in January 1941, she received a letter on plain stationery with no official letterhead, asking her to come to a specific address in Georgetown for an interview. No explanation, no details, just a date and time and an address of a townhouse that looked like any other on a quiet residential street. The man who interviewed her never gave his name. He was in his 50s, dressed in a suit that was expensive but not ostentatious, and he asked her questions that seemed to have nothing to do with her qualifications. How did she handle stress? Had she ever lied to someone she cared about? Could she kill someone if necessary? Catherine answered honestly, even the last question, which she had never considered before. Yes, she said, if it meant stopping Hitler, if it meant saving lives, if it meant protecting her country, she thought she probably could. The man studied her for a long moment, then told her that if she was serious about serving, if she was willing to do things that would never be acknowledged or rewarded, if she understood that she might die alone in a foreign country with no one ever knowing what she had sacrificed, then there might be a place for her, not in the State Department, not in any official capacity, but in the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, the organization that would eventually become the CIA. They needed people who could blend in, who could lie convincingly, who could operate behind enemy lines gathering intelligence and supporting resistance movements. They especially needed women, because a woman traveling alone in occupied Europe aroused less suspicion than a man. Catherine said yes before he finished explaining the risks. The training took place at a facility in rural Maryland that the recruits called a farm, though its official designation was classified. Catherine spent 6 months learning things that her father would never have imagined teaching her. How to pick locks and crack safes. How to shoot a pistol accurately at 20 yards. How to construct and operate a radio transmitter small enough to hide in a suitcase. How to forge documents and mix invisible inks. How to recognize different models of German military vehicles and estimate troop strength from railroad traffic patterns. How to kill silently with knife or with bare hands, though the instructor stressed that violence was always a last resort, that the best spy was one who never had to fight because they were never suspected. She learned code and ciphers, memorized recognition signals, practiced constructing cover stories that would hold up under interrogation. The instructors were mostly British, men from MI6 and SOE, who had already been fighting this war for 2 years and who looked at their American students with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Catherine proved to be one of their best students, not because she was physically exceptional. She was 5'6", slender, with the kind of unremarkable features that made her easy to forget, but because she could lie without hesitation and think 3 steps ahead in any situation. If you're still with me, if Catherine's journey from a frustrated teacher to a trained operative has already begun to pull you in, then you understand something important. These weren't just women following orders. These were women who chose to step into the darkness, who volunteered for work that could destroy them, because they believed in something bigger than their own safety. Subscribe now, because what happens next will show you exactly how far one person can go when they decide that some things are worth any risk, any sacrifice, any price at all. By the summer of 1942, Catherine was ready for deployment, and the OSS had the perfect mission for someone with her particular skills. The German occupation of France depended on a complex supply network that moved food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment from factories in Germany to the troops stationed throughout France and the Low Countries. The network was efficient, carefully planned, and surprisingly vulnerable if you knew where to strike. The Germans used French rail lines, French warehouses, and French collaborators to manage the logistics, which meant there were weak points. Places where the right intelligence or the right act of sabotage could cause cascading disruptions. The OSS wanted to map this network, identify the critical nodes, and feed that information to both the French resistance and Allied planners who were already thinking about the eventual invasion of Europe. They needed someone who could move freely through Paris, someone with a plausible reason to be asking questions and making connections, someone who wouldn't attract German suspicion. They decided Catherine would be a bride-to-be, an American woman who had come to Paris before the war, fallen in love with a French aristocrat, and was now trying to plan a wedding despite the occupation. The cover story was brilliant in its simplicity. Catherine would be Catherine Rousseau, an American who had been living in Paris since 1938, teaching English to wealthy French families. She had fallen in love with Philippe Rousseau, supposedly a distant relative, which was why they shared a surname, a minor aristocrat from an old Burgundy family who was currently serving with the Vichy government in a minor administrative role. The wedding was planned for the spring of 1943, and Catherine was spending the winter making arrangements, which gave her a reason to travel, to meet with vendors and officials, to ask questions about supply chains and transportation routes. The French resistance had provided the necessary documentation, ration cards, and even a small apartment in the Marais district that had belonged to a Jewish family deported to camps. Everything about the cover was designed to make Catherine invisible, just another foreign woman navigating complexities of life in occupied Paris, too focused on her personal concerns to be a threat to anyone. She arrived in Paris in October 1942, traveling through neutral Spain and then across the border, using forged papers that identified her as a Swiss national. The city she entered bore only a superficial resemblance to the Paris of postcards and romantic films. The grand boulevards were still there, the cafés and monuments and the Seine flowing under its beautiful bridges. But the soul of the city had changed. German soldiers were everywhere, young men who treated Paris like a prize they'd won, strolling to the Luxembourg Gardens or drinking wine at sidewalk cafés while Parisians hurried past with their eyes down. The food shortages had already begun. Meat was almost impossible to find. Vegetables were wilted and expensive, and bread was made from flour mixed with sawdust and chestnuts. The metro still ran, but only until 9 in the evening, when the curfew began and the streets emptied except for German patrols and the occasional resistance fighter moving through the shadows. Catherine's apartment was a third-floor walk-up with a view of a narrow street, where laundry hung between buildings, and children still played despite everything, their laughter sounding defiant in the heavy silence. Her contact in Paris was a woman named Simone Leroux, a schoolteacher in her 40s who had been working with the resistance since the fall of France. They met in the Jardin des Tuileries, sitting on a bench near the fountain where mothers brought their children to sail toy boats in the basin. Simone looked like anyone's favorite aunt, round-faced and comfortable, the kind of woman you would ask for directions without thinking twice. She was also one of the most effective intelligence agents in Paris, running a network of informants that included railroad workers, shopkeepers, secretaries in German offices, and even a few German soldiers who had become disillusioned with the occupation. She briefed Catherine on the current situation, speaking in rapid French while feeding breadcrumbs to the pigeons as though they were discussing nothing more important than the weather. The German supply network was vast, Simone explained, but it had predictable patterns. Trains arrived at 3 major rail yards. Trucks distributed supplies from 5 main warehouses. Everything was documented, recorded in triplicate, because the Germans loved their paperwork, and that documentation was where Catherine needed to focus. If they could get access to shipping manifests, inventory records, railway schedules, they could map the entire network and identify exactly where to strike for maximum disruption. Catherine's cover as a bride gave her access to places that would normally be off-limits. She needed flowers for the wedding, which meant meeting with florists who also supplied the German officers' mess. She needed food for the reception, which meant talking to black market vendors who sourced supplies from the same warehouses that served the Wehrmacht. She needed a dress, which meant visiting seamstresses who worked for the wives of Vichy officials. Every conversation was an intelligence-gathering opportunity, every vendor a potential source of information. Catherine played her role perfectly. The slightly anxious American woman who spoke French with a charming accent and worried endlessly about whether she could find enough champagne for 200 guests in occupied Paris. People wanted to help her, wanted to be part of something as normal and hopeful as a wedding, and in their eagerness to assist, they revealed details they would never have shared with someone who seemed interested in German logistics. Within 3 weeks, Catherine had mapped out 2 of the 5 main warehouses and identified a German captain named Friedrich Weber, who was responsible for food distribution to the Paris garrison. Weber was 38, married with 2 children back in Hamburg, and desperately homesick. He frequented a cafe on the Rue de Rivoli where he would sit alone drinking schnapps and writing letters home, and Catherine arranged to meet him by accident when she came in looking for the cafe's owner to discuss catering options. Weber was lonely, and Catherine was pretty and spoke German well enough to compliment him on his efficiency in keeping Paris fed despite the difficulties. They struck up a conversation that became a series of conversations, and within a month, Weber was telling her all about the challenges of military logistics, the constant shortages, the trains that arrived late, the warehouses that were poorly organized. He never suspected that the sympathetic American woman listening to his complaints was memorizing every detail and passing along to Simone, who forwarded it to London. The fake wedding became Catherine's shield and her weapon. She spent hours in her apartment, supposedly writing guest lists and planning seating arrangements, while actually coding intelligence reports and operating a radio transmitter hidden inside a large wardrobe. She met with a printer to discuss wedding invitations and left with information about a Wehrmacht printing facility that produced all the official passes and travel documents for the Paris region. She visited a photographer to arrange for wedding pictures and learned that he also photographed German installations for their propaganda magazines, which meant he had access to sensitive locations. Every aspect of the wedding planning gave her a reason to move through the city, to ask questions, to build relationships with people who had the information the Allies needed. And because she was planning a wedding, because she seemed so focused on that singular feminine concern, nobody suspected her of anything more sinister. The winter of 1942 to 43 was particularly harsh in Paris. with snow falling in January and the temperature dropping below freezing for weeks. Fuel was scarce, and Catherine's apartment was so cold that ice formed on the inside of the windows. She slept in layers of clothing and worked at night by candlelight because the electricity was rationed. The hunger was worse than the cold. Her ration card allowed her barely enough food to survive, and she lost weight steadily, her clothes hanging loose, her face becoming gaunt. But she kept working, kept meeting with vendors and informants, kept feeding information to Simone. The intelligence she gathered was extraordinary in its scope. She documented the arrival schedule for fuel shipments, identified which warehouses stored ammunition versus food, mapped out the security protocols at each major facility, and even obtained copies of transportation permits that showed exactly when and where German supply columns would be moving. All of this information went to London, where it was analyzed and used to plan bombing raids and resistance sabotage operations. In February 1943, Catherine's carefully constructed cover nearly collapsed. A Gestapo officer named Klaus Richter had been assigned to investigate possible intelligence leaks in the Paris supply network. Several recent sabotage operations had been too precisely targeted, suggesting that someone had detailed information about German logistics. Richter was methodical and suspicious, the kind of man who trusted no one and questioned everything. He began interviewing anyone who had unusual access to supply information, which included all the vendors and contractors who worked with the German military. Catherine's name came up because she had been asking a lot of questions, meeting with many different suppliers, showing interest in aspects of their business that seemed irrelevant to wedding planning. Why did she want to know which trains her florist used to receive shipments? Why did she care about warehouse locations? Richter summoned her to Gestapo headquarters on the Avenue Foch, a building that every Parisian knew as a place where people entered and often didn't leave. The interview took place in a second-floor office that had probably belonged to a French bureaucrat before the occupation. It was almost aggressively ordinary, with filing cabinets and a wooden desk and a window that looked out on a courtyard where German soldiers were doing calisthenics. Richter was in his 40s, thin and precise, with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of pausing between questions as though weighing every answer. He asked Catherine about her background, her relationship with Philippe Rousseau, her reasons for staying in Paris during the occupation. Catherine told her cover story perfectly, adding small details that made it more believable. She and Philippe had met at a dinner party in 1939, had fallen in love despite her family's objections to her marrying a Frenchman, had decided to stay in Paris when the war started because leaving would have meant abandoning him. She showed Richter photographs, letters, every piece of documentation that the resistance had provided. She cried when talking about how difficult it was to plan a wedding under occupation, how she just wanted one normal thing in the middle of all this madness. Richter listened without expression, making notes in a leather-bound notebook, and when the interview was over after 3 hours, he dismissed her with a warning that she should be more careful about the questions she asked. He didn't say he believed her, but he didn't arrest her either. That night, Catherine met Simone in the Père Lachaise cemetery, walking among the elaborate tombs of famous Parisians as though visiting a relative's grave. She reported the interview, and Simone's expression grew grave. The Gestapo was getting too close. Catherine needed to either pull back and stop gathering intelligence, or she needed to take more aggressive action to distract them. Pulling back wasn't an option. The invasion was coming. Everyone knew it, and the intelligence Catherine was providing would be crucial to its success. That left escalation. Simone proposed something audacious. What if the wedding actually happened? Not a real wedding, of course, but a large public event that would involve so many German officials and French collaborators that Catherine would be above suspicion afterward. If she could pull off a wedding that important people attended, nobody would believe she was a spy. The event itself would become her proof of innocence. Catherine understood the logic, but she also understood the risks. A fake wedding required a fake groom, which meant pulling someone else into her cover story, someone who would have to play the role convincingly enough to fool Germans who were already suspicious. The resistance found her a groom. His name was actually Jean-Baptiste Fournier, though he would play the role of Philippe Rousseau. He was 32, a former officer in the French army who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp in Germany and made his way back to France to join the resistance. He was from Burgundy, as the cover story required, and he had the aristocratic bearing and education to play the part of a minor nobleman. He was also completely committed to the resistance cause, having lost his wife and infant daughter in a German bombing raid in 1940. When Simone explained what was needed, Jean-Baptiste agreed without hesitation. He understood that playing Catherine's fiancé would make him a target if the cover was blown, but he also understood that the intelligence she was gathering could save thousands of Allied lives when the invasion finally came. They met in a safe house in Montmartre, and Catherine found herself looking at a tall, serious man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much death. They would need to be convincing as a couple in love, which meant spending time together, learning each other's stories, developing the kind of intimate knowledge that real couples had. It was strange and uncomfortable, building a fake relationship that had to feel real, but both of them were professionals, and they did what needed to be done. The wedding was planned for April 15, 1943, at the Church of St. Sulpice, one of Paris's most impressive churches, with a reception to follow at a restaurant near the Luxembourg Gardens. Catherine sent invitations to everyone she had met during her months of wedding planning: the vendors, the German officers, the Vichy officials, the collaborators. She included Friedrich Weber, the lonely supply officer, and he accepted enthusiastically, promising to bring real German champagne as a gift. She invited Klaus Richter as well, a calculated risk that Simone had suggested. If Richter attended the wedding and saw how public and ordinary it was, he might finally dismiss his suspicions. The preparations consumed Catherine's days. She had to make the wedding look real, which meant actually arranging flowers, actually ordering food, actually having a dress made by a seamstress who charged outrageous prices in occupation francs. The resistance provided the money, understanding that the investment would be worth it if the wedding successfully cemented Catherine's cover. Jean-Baptiste moved into an apartment near Catherine's, and they were seen together around the neighborhood, holding hands, looking at each other with what appeared to be genuine affection. At night, when they were alone, they would drop the act and discuss the intelligence Catherine was still gathering, the details she was still passing to London, the growing sense that time was running out. 3 days before the wedding, Catherine received new orders from London via coded radio transmission. The Allies were planning a major operation targeting German supply depots throughout northern France, timed to coincide with other operations that would stretch German logistics to the breaking point. They needed detailed information on one specific warehouse in St. Denis, just north of Paris, which intelligence suggested was being used to stockpile fuel for German tanks. Catherine had already identified this warehouse in her earlier reports, but London wanted more: exact layouts, security protocols, the schedule for guard changes, everything that would be needed to mount a successful raid. The problem was that the warehouse was heavily guarded and access was restricted to authorized German personnel. Catherine had no plausible reason to visit it, and trying to get inside would be extraordinarily dangerous, especially with the Gestapo already suspicious. But London insisted. The information was critical, and Catherine was in the best position to obtain it. The transmission ended with a phrase that made her blood run cold: "At your discretion, authorized terminal solution if necessary." They were telling her that if she had to kill someone to get the information, she had permission. It was the first time her mission had explicitly included the possibility of lethal force. Catherine spent that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of her freezing apartment and thinking about what she had become. 2 years ago, she had been a teacher, frustrated and idealistic, but essentially innocent. Now she was being asked to break into a heavily guarded German facility and, if necessary, kill whoever got in her way. The woman who had answered questions about French irregular verbs seemed like someone from another life. But Catherine understood that she had chosen this path, had volunteered for it, and that the information London wanted could save lives when the invasion came. She made her decision sometime around 3 a.m, as the first light of dawn began to gray the sky outside her window. She would get the information, whatever it took, and she would do it before the wedding, so that if something went wrong, if she was caught or killed, at least Jean-Baptiste and the resistance network wouldn't be compromised by association with her failure. The warehouse in St. Denis was an ugly concrete structure built before the war to store industrial materials. The Germans had fortified it with barbed wire fences, guard towers, and patrols that circled the perimeter every hour. Catherine spent 2 days observing it from various positions, pretending to be a woman waiting for a bus or shopping at the few stores that still had anything to sell. She identified the patterns, the weak points, the brief moments when sections of the fence were unobserved. The biggest challenge was getting inside the building itself, which required passing through a gate guarded by 2 soldiers who checked credentials against a list. Catherine had an idea, a terrible idea, but it might work. Friedrich Weber, her lonely German captain, had mentioned that he occasionally visited the St. Denis warehouse to inspect inventory. If she could convince him to take her along, if she could make it seem like a spontaneous romantic gesture, she might be able to get inside. It was risky and manipulative and required using Weber's feelings in a way that made her feel sick, but Catherine had stopped letting guilt prevent her from doing what was necessary. She met Weber at their usual cafe and told him a story. She was so stressed about the wedding, she said, so overwhelmed by all the planning and the pressure, that she just needed a break, needed to get out of Paris for a few hours. Could he possibly take her with him on one of his inspection trips? Just a ride in his staff car. To see something different, to have a few hours where she didn't have to think about flower arrangements and seating charts? Weber was delighted. He had been hoping for weeks that Catherine might show more interest in him, and here she was, asking to spend time together. He explained that he had an inspection scheduled at the St. Denis warehouse the next afternoon, and she was welcome to come along. She couldn't enter the warehouse itself, of course. Security regulations forbade civilians, but she could wait in his office while he conducted the inspection, and maybe they could have an early dinner afterward? Catherine agreed with a smile that felt like broken glass in her mouth, thanked him profusely, and went home prepared for what would either be her greatest success or her last mission. The next afternoon, Catherine sat in the back of Weber's staff car as it drove to the northern suburbs of Paris toward St. Denis. She wore a simple dress and carried a small handbag that contained a notebook, a pen, and a tiny camera that the OSS had provided during her training. The camera was disguised as a cigarette lighter and could take 12 photographs before the film needed to be changed. Getting the camera into the warehouse would be a miracle. Actually using it without being caught would require luck she wasn't sure she had. Weber sat beside her in the back seat, talking about the challenges of maintaining supply chains when resources were being diverted to the Eastern Front, complaining about the incompetence of his superiors, completely oblivious to the fact that he was providing intelligence with every word. The warehouse loomed ahead, surrounded by fences and guards, and Catherine felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine whether she survived to see her fake wedding. The guards at the gate snapped to attention when they recognized Weber's car. He showed his credentials, and the gate swung open. They drove into a courtyard where several trucks were being loaded with crates and barrels. Weber pointed out various features of the facility, proud of the efficiency of his organization, and Catherine nodded and smiled and memorized every detail. The staff car stopped near the main building, and Weber helped her out, explaining that his office was on the second floor and she could wait there comfortably while he conducted his inspection. He escorted her upstairs, unlocked a small office with a window overlooking the warehouse floor, and settled her into a chair with a cup of terrible ersatz coffee before heading off to check inventory lists. Catherine waited exactly 30 seconds after he left, then moved the door and looked out into the corridor. Empty. The building was designed with offices along one side and the warehouse floor along the other, separated by a wall with windows that allowed supervisors to observe operations below. Catherine slipped out of the office and moved quietly down the corridor, trying doors until she found one that was unlocked. Inside was a filing room, walls lined with shelves holding folders and ledgers. Catherine pulled out her camera lighter and began photographing everything she could find. Shipping manifests, inventory records, security protocols, maps showing the layout of the facility and the location of different types of supplies. She worked as fast as she dared, her hands shaking slightly, listening for footsteps in the corridor outside. She had maybe 10 minutes before Weber finished his inspection and returned to the office. 8 minutes. 6 minutes. She photographed a document that showed the schedule for fuel deliveries, including dates, quantities, and the routes trucks would take. For minutes, she found a map that marked the locations of every supply depot in northern France. 2 minutes. She heard voices in the corridor, Weber's familiar tones, and another man's voice, closer than they should be. Catherine shoved the files back onto the shelf, pocketed her camera, and slipped out of the filing room just as the voices turned the corner. She made it back to Weber's office with perhaps 20 seconds to spare, sitting down and picking up her coffee cup just as Weber entered with another officer, both of them laughing about something. Weber introduced the other officer, asked if she had been comfortable, and apologized for taking longer than expected. Catherine smiled and assured him it was fine. She had enjoyed the quiet, and then allowed herself to be escorted back to the staff car for the drive back to Paris. She delivered the film to Simone that night, and within 48 hours, the information was in London. The photographs Catherine had taken provided everything the Allies needed to plan their raid on the St. Denis warehouse. But more than that, the intelligence she had gathered over the past 6 months had given the Allies a complete picture of German supply networks throughout northern France. When the invasion finally came, when Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, they had detailed knowledge of where German supplies were located, how they were transported, and where to strike to cause maximum disruption. The D-Day invasion succeeded for many reasons, but one small part of that success was due to a woman from Virginia who had spent 6 months pretending to plan a wedding while systematically mapping out the infrastructure that kept the German army functioning. The fake wedding itself took place as scheduled on April 15, 1943, and it was, by all accounts, a beautiful ceremony. Catherine wore a dress of white silk that had been painstakingly altered from a gown found in an abandoned Jewish family's apartment. Jean-Baptiste wore a borrowed suit that almost fit, and he spoke his vows with sincerity that made several guests tear up. Friedrich Weber attended and got drunk on his own German champagne. Klaus Richter was there as well, watching everyone with his suspicious eyes. At the end of the reception, he approached Catherine and wished her happiness. He never said whether he believed she was really just a bride, but he never investigated her again. The wedding guests included German officers, Vichy officials, black market vendors, and at least a dozen resistance members who were posing as Catherine's American friends. The reception was held in a private room at a restaurant that had once been famous for cuisine, but now served whatever could be obtained through connections and bribes. People danced to a gramophone, drank wine that tasted like vinegar, and for a few hours pretended that Paris was still the city of light and that the war was something happening far away to other people. After the wedding, Catherine and Jean-Baptiste maintained their cover as a married couple for another 6 months. They lived together in Catherine's apartment, continued to gather intelligence, and became fixtures in the neighborhood, the American woman, and her French aristocrat husband who had somehow managed to find happiness despite everything. In private, they were colleagues and eventually friends, bonded by the shared knowledge of what they were really doing and the constant danger they were living in. Jean-Baptiste turned out to be a skilled intelligence officer in his own right, using his connections with Vichy officials to gather information about German military movements. Together, they formed a highly effective team, and the intelligence they provided helped the Allies plan not just the invasion, but the subsequent liberation of France. But the cost of this success was enormous. They lived every day knowing that discovery meant torture and execution. They watched friends and fellow resistance members disappear into Gestapo prisons. They became harder, more cynical, more willing to do terrible things because the cause justified it. The woman who wanted to work for the State Department was gone, replaced by someone who could look into Friedrich Weber's trusting eyes and betray him without hesitation, someone who could smile at a Gestapo officer while planning his death. In August 1944, as Allied forces closed in on Paris, the resistance rose up in open revolt. Catherine and Jean-Baptiste participated in the uprising, fighting alongside French forces of the interior as they seized control of government buildings and police stations. Catherine carried a pistol that she had never expected to use and fired it at German soldiers who were trying to maintain control of a neighborhood that had decided it was done being occupied. She saw Jean-Baptiste shot in the leg during a firefight near the Hotel de Ville and dragged him to safety while bullets chipped the stone around them. She watched Paris liberate itself in a chaos of gunfire and jubilation, and when American troops finally entered the city on August 25th, she stood in the crowd on the Champs-Élysées and cried for the first time in 2 years. Not tears of joy, exactly, but tears of exhaustion and relief and grief for everything she had lost along the way. After the war, Catherine was debriefed by OSS officers who praised her work and gave her a commendation that would remain classified for decades. She was offered a position with the newly forming Central Intelligence Agency, but she declined. She had spent 3 years lying, manipulating, and betraying people's trust, and she was done. She wanted to go home, to see her father, to try to become someone she could recognize in the mirror. She returned to Virginia in October 1944, and for months, she couldn't adjust to civilian life. Everything seemed too safe, too comfortable, too trivial. Her father tried to understand, but how could she explain what she had done, what she had become? She couldn't tell him about the warehouse or the fake wedding or the intelligence that had helped win the war. All of it was classified, locked away in files that wouldn't be opened for 50 years. She took a position teaching French at a high school in Richmond, and for the rest of her life, that was what people knew her as. Miss Hayes, the French teacher who had spent some time in Europe during the war, but never talked about it. Jean-Baptiste survived the war and stayed in France, eventually marrying a woman from his hometown in Burgundy and raising 3 children who never knew that their father had once posed as someone else's husband to help defeat the Germans. He and Catherine exchanged letters once a year, brief notes that said nothing about what they had done together, but conveyed a connection that couldn't be put into words. When he died in 1989, his daughter sent Catherine a photograph that had been found among his effects. It was from the fake wedding, showing Catherine and Jean-Baptiste standing together outside St. Sulpice, both of them smiling at the camera with expressions that looked almost genuine. On the back, in Jean-Baptiste's handwriting, was a single line, "The bravest person I ever knew." Catherine kept that photograph in her desk drawer for the rest of her life. Friedrich Weber survived the war as well, returned to Hamburg to find his wife and children had been killed in an Allied bombing raid. He never learned that the friendly American woman who had seemed so interested in his work had been a spy, that she had used his loneliness to gather intelligence that contributed to Germany's defeat. In the 1950s, he wrote a memoir about his experiences during the war, and it included a passage about an American woman he had met in Paris, a woman planning her wedding who had briefly made him feel less alone. He remembered her with fondness, never suspecting the truth. Catherine read the memoir when it was translated into English, and she felt the weight of it, the knowledge that she had deceived a man who had been kind to her, who had trusted her, who had never meant her any harm personally, even though he served a monstrous regime. There was no way to reconcile these contradictions, no way to feel completely right about what she had done. War created these impossible situations, demanded these terrible choices, and left everyone damaged in ways that never fully healed. Catherine lived until 2003, dying at the age of 87 in the same Richmond house where she had grown up. Her obituary in the local newspaper described her as a retired teacher and made brief mention of her service during World War II. It wasn't until 2008, when the OSS files were finally declassified, that the full story emerged. Historians found her reports, her intelligence summaries, the photographs she had taken in the St. Denis warehouse. They traced her impact through the subsequent historical record, showing how the information she provided had been used in planning the D-Day invasion and the liberation of France. Articles were written, a biography was published, and suddenly Catherine Hayes was being celebrated as one of the most effective intelligence operatives of World War II. But by then, she wasn't alive to see it, to explain in her own words what it had been like, to clarify the parts that historians could only guess at. What remained was the documentary record and the memories of the few people who had known her story, and it was from these fragments that the truth slowly emerged. The fake wedding became legend in intelligence circles, taught as a case study in cover operations, and the use of social engineering to gather intelligence. Future spies studied Catherine's methods, analyzed her techniques, tried to understand how she had maintained her cover under such pressure. But what they couldn't capture in their analyses was the emotional cost, the psychological weight of lying to everyone around you, of using people's trust as a weapon, of living for years in constant fear while pretending everything was fine. Catherine had done all of this and survived, but survival wasn't the same as winning. She carried those scars for the rest of her life, the nightmares that never completely faded, the relationships she could never quite commit to because trust had become such a complicated concept, the sense that she had left part of herself in that Paris apartment and would never get it back. The supply line she helped to disrupt saved lives, shorten the war, contributed to the liberation of millions of people from Nazi occupation. The intelligence she gathered gave Allied planners the knowledge they needed to make better decisions, to strike more effectively, to win battles that might otherwise have been lost. Every resistance fighter who received supplies, every Allied soldier who landed in Normandy with good intelligence, every French civilian who lived to see liberation, they all benefited, directly or indirectly, from the work Catherine Hayes did while pretending to plan a wedding. She was one person among thousands who worked in the shadows to defeat Hitler, but her contribution was measurable and significant. The title of spy never quite fit her. She was too complex for labels, too aware of the moral ambiguities. She was a woman who made impossible choices and lived with the consequences, who sacrificed her innocence so that others might be free, who understood that heroism often looked like betrayal from certain angles. If you've made it to the end of Catherine's story, if you felt even a fraction of what she must have felt living that double life in occupied Paris, then you understand why these stories need to be told. These weren't just victories. They were survival. They were sacrifice. They were ordinary people becoming extraordinary because history demanded it. Leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end, so I know you were here for this entire journey." Hit that like button, not for the algorithm, but because Catherine's courage deserves to be remembered and shared. And when you're ready, there's another story waiting, another piece of hidden history that shows us who we were and who we can be. I'll see you there.